Welcome to 3-Night Weekend, where we prepare you for the weekend to come with the help of gaming industry luminaries. I'm Shane Satterfield, and you can find me on the world's most advanced gaming website, SIFTD, at sifted.net, or on Twitter at Dinfire. If you want to support the show, head to patreon.com/sifted. The show goes live every Friday for our patrons, and the following Monday for everyone else. This week, we talk with James Mielke. Known as the Milkman during his glory days of EGM, he's lived an eclectic life that saw him go from being an artist at Marvel to one of the industry's most recognizable journalists to a game developer responsible for invigorating the indie scene in Japan. A big, hearty welcome to James Mielke, the Milkman, as you may know him from EGM. It is a pleasure and an honor to have you on the show. Welcome.
Thanks, Shane. Glad to hear you for the first time in a while.
It has been quite a while. James, we have kind of connected across the years in the games industry because we were both DJs in a prior life.
Yeah.
There aren't many of us in games journalism or in the industry in general, really.
I know, I think that's because I think most of the people that I know in the games industry really just kind of came up. They're a little bit younger than I am, so they came up just loving games and all that stuff. And I grew up loving games, but I also didn't have as many games when I was a kid because the whole industry didn't really exist then.
You're dating yourself big time, James.
I hate to say it, but it didn't really exist as such as it is now, like an ever-present, omnipresent entertainment medium. It was still like in that unproven hobby kind of era, right? Of like Pong, ColecoVision, Atari 2600. You didn't know if it was going to stick around or if it was just going to be a fad like Cabbage Patch Kids or whatever. But
Tickle Me Elmo.
Exactly. So, but so the most of the kids that I got to work with, they they came up with
in
gaming.
The PlayStation era, probably, or the Super Nintendo was their first system, or
trust me, I was jealous of all those guys, like all the guys I used to work with, like Shane Bettenhausen and Christian Nutt, and those guys. They're all talking about, they have a real fondness for like the early days of Final Fantasy because they imported those cartridges and stuff. And I'm like, well, somebody bought them those cartridges because nobody was buying that stuff. They were like $60, $70, $80, if you were importing or whatever. And
imports are still expensive to this day.
Yeah, but I missed out on most of that stuff because I was worried about paying rent, right? Yeah. And like I was
you were an adult already trying to survive.
Yeah, in New York City, working 4 jobs trying to pay rent and also having enough money to eat and all that stuff. I did have a Sega Genesis, but I totally skipped over the Super Nintendo. And cartridges were expensive, so me dropping $60 on Street Fighter or whatever, or Legend of Oasis or something like that, or what else I had like Sonic the Hedgehog, of course, because it was free, but Toe Jam and Earl, stuff like that. Those were very calculated decisions. It's not like these days where you're day one on everything, right? Yeah.
I was lucky. I always had people to trade with. So like I had the Super Nintendo, I had a buddy who had the Genesis, and we would just trade games. I would get a couple and he would get a couple. We'd play them, and then we'd trade systems for a week or two. He'd play my Super Nintendo games. I'd play his Sega games. You had to work it, man. Because I was like you, I didn't have a lot of money for games as a kid.
Working 13 hours a night bartending in New York City in a hot spot, let me tell you, I was trading nothing with nobody.
James, let's talk a little bit about your childhood. Where were you brought up? How were you brought up? How did you first get exposed to games?
Well, I grew up in New York, and my mom was Japanese, so that was basically how I got into gaming. It's weird. It all kind of happened at the same time, just like most kids in the 70s and 80s. I remember first seeing a Space Invaders arcade cabinet in like the local department store, a small town department store outside of New York City. And I was like, what is that? Because I saw all these kids hanging around it. I was like, what is that? I ran up to it. And I just saw like the slow moving vector graphics aliens marching across the screen.
Dun.
Exactly. I was mesmerized. I saw the row of quarters up top on the marquee. I saw all these kids playing, it was just like one of those scenes out of like, Terminator or something like that, where you got the kids playing on the arcades and
Stranger
on the games in the
Things.
arcades. Yeah, strange. All those things. I was there, and that was such a good time. But once I got hooked on games like that, they kept on coming. It was Pac-Man, Galaga, Donkey Kong, and once I was hooked on those arcade games, my uncle, probably around 1980, 81, started sending me Nintendo Game and Watches from
Oh,
Japan. And in those days, very, very specifically, you can almost set your clock to it. In those days, anything that was hot in Japan would come out in America 2 years later, right?
yeah. The delay was
Everything.
that intense. Yep.
Yeah, like whether it was like Robotech, Macross turning into Robotech, whatever, Transformers, all that stuff. I would get it first because my uncle would send it to me for Christmas or my birthday. And that was almost always 2 years before anybody else had that stuff. So I was the coolest kid
You
on
were
the
the
block.
man on the block.
I had a Mickey Mouse digital watch, and that blew people's minds because they were like, "What is that?" Right? Because it played like the Mickey Mouse theme, and
Uh-huh.
everybody was like, they wanted to hear it over and over again until the battery was dead. It was amazing. But yeah, so that's how I got into it. Amazingly, and even though like the Nintendo Entertainment System was the first kind of console that I bought for myself, I had Atari before. I didn't have a ColecoVision. My neighbor had that. I saved up and bought a NES with my first part-time job salary, and but weirdly, I didn't grow up like a real Nintendo fanboy. I think I was always more of a Sega person myself.
Hmm.
So
Why is
that's how
that, do you think?
gaming. I think it was because of the fact that once I started having more of a disposable income, once I actually started working in the nightlife, bartending and DJing, I had more money to burn. So
Mhm.
I was always down in Chinatown in New York City where they had the import shops, and I was picking up the games because I could and because I wanted to. And then eventually, because that sort of turned into a hobby, that turned into a part-time, like kind of freelance job, which turned into a career. Um, I think I have the strongest memories of like the Sega Saturn primarily, and then of
Wow.
course
Not many people can say that.
yeah, like the PlayStation was popular, but I was really into Virtua Fighter. I was
Hmm.
into Daytona USA and stuff like that. So the Saturn gave me what I really wanted, and I like the PlayStation 2. I was always in with had all the early stuff like Toshinden and Ridge Racer and stuff, but I don't know, like something about the Saturn really clicked with me, and a lot of the 2D games there too.
Hmm.
I mean, the Japanese games, all the import stuff was fantastic. So that's kind of like that's my system, the Sega Saturn. And then the Sega Dreamcast kind of arrived at the same time as my actual gaming career. So I have strong Sega memories.
Now you just alluded to the fact that you were kind of a part of the nightlife in New York City. You were a DJ. You're also a model, correct?
Yeah, for a minute. It was
What was
that
that
was probably
like?
yeah. Well, I worked in a bar. The bar that I worked at for 5 years in New York, that was they basically hired you if you look like everybody there basically looked like a club kid. So that meant most of the people who worked there were either kind of part-time actors, you know, who were moonlighting as bartenders or waiters in
Hmm.
New York City while they were waiting for pilot season to come around in LA, and then those guys would take off, or
Hmm.
they were musicians, or they were models, or they were people who looked like one of those clicks, I guess, right? I was
Uh-huh.
I was none of them. I was none of them. I was just like, just in the right place at the right time. I had a funky look. I either had like bleached blonde hair or was bald or had like really long hair down to my waist. It was all over the place. But like I don't know, I guess I fit in with that club kid scene. And then just being in that part of town, which was in like the advertising district in New York City,
Hmm.
you had agents come in all the time. So
Right.
eventually, so one of them came up to me and asked me if I had an agent. I said no. They said come in and talk to me, and I went in and talked to them, and they set me up with a photographer to go take some test shots. And they were like, "Yeah, we can work with this." And they just started sending me out on go sees, which are appointments to go show your portfolio. And people think that sounds really cool, and it is. And I definitely did some cool gigs like Diesel Jeans and Vibe magazine, and got to hang out with the Beastie Boys and stuff,
Nice.
and go to parties with people like David Lee Roth, which was just insane. But
Wait a minute. How did that happen?
because one of the girls who used to come into the place where I bartended, she was like a very busy model at that time, and she was friends with David Lee Roth and Bob Guccione Jr. And we
Wow.
went over to Bob Guccione Jr.'s. This is the for anybody who doesn't know, the publisher of Spin Magazine
Hmm.
and the son of the publisher of Penthouse. Um, we went over to a party at Bob Guccione Jr.'s Penthouse in New York City, in like the meatpacking district in New York City, and we went with David Lee Roth. And I just sat there and talked to David Lee Roth. I was the one, all these models and shit, like at this party, and all these high society people, and I'm sitting there talking to David Lee Roth about his music,
That's
which
awesome.
I think is what made him, like, I guess, like, appreciate me, because I was actually going into kind of the nuances of some of his first full-length solo album, not Crazy from the Heat, his EP with Just a Gigolo, but like the first full album that he did. And
He
I
was
was like,
huge then. I mean,
yeah,
huge. Like he
I
ruled MTV for a good like 6 years.
remember Just a Gigolo, I Ain't Got Nobody, like
Yeah.
that medley, right? And then Just Like Paradise. This was
Yeah.
that era, right?
Yep.
And I tried listening to that album the other day, and it does not hold up that well.
I'm
But
surprised to hear that.
it was still cool. I was sitting down talking to the lead singer of Van Halen, well, ex-lead singer at that point, but still the lead singer of Van Halen, about his solo work. And he was like, yeah, man, he was just telling me all these stories. And he's exactly like you would imagine him to be. So
Really.
that was fun, yeah. But
So
the modeling thing, yeah, it wasn't really so glamorous for the for every 4 or 5 jobs, you'd have to go to like 30 demoralizing appointments to go show them your portfolio. They'd skim through it, they'd look at it, they'd take a tear sheet, and they'd be like, bye.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
So not so fun.
So did you ended up going to art school, correct?
Yeah.
Was
I
that
went
while
to
you were doing this DJing and modeling?
I went to school. Well, it was after I got done at the School of Visual Arts in New York City that I actually kind of segued into everything else, because I
Okay.
was I was working I was working for the School of Visual Arts, but like that was my first full-time job, and it only paid like $13,000 a year.
Whew. Even back
And
then, that is peanuts in New York City,
e-
no less.
even in 1990, that was like not a lot. And that was before taxes. So, and my rent was $900 a month. So you
You
can
could do the math.
basically, I was like taking a net loss every month. So I said to my one of the teachers that was always in the administrative offices where I worked at SVA. He was like this cool black dude, long dreads, just real handsome dude. I said, Charles, man, I am like struggling. I need to make some extra money. Do you know anywhere I can get a part-time job or something? He said, like, oh, you got the look. You should go down to the coffee shop. And then, so that was like a really weird thing for me to hear, because I was like, I had no idea about what the look meant. And
Uh-huh.
the second thing was, he said the coffee shop, and I was like, I need to have a certain look to push
To
donuts
work at
in
a
coffee.
coffee shop.
I honestly didn't know. And then but when I went down there, I found out that the title was really ironic. It was this very trendy restaurant that moved into an old space that used to be like a 1950s style diner, but they remade it as a whole like neo-Brazilian kind of vibe, amazing interior. And at that time in my young life, I had never seen like truly beautiful women or human beings in general.
Uh-huh.
The ladies who handed me the application, one of whom I'm still friends with now, were just jaw dropping, like gorgeous, just unbelievable. And I almost didn't know how to speak. I don't know how I got through that interview, because the owners were all models. So they were basically screening everybody like they were, doing club, you know, door
Promotions. Yeah.
attendance. Yeah, it was like, oh, are you good enough to work here or whatever? They didn't care about experience. They just cared about like what I guess your
Your
vibe was.
vibe. Yeah.
So anyway, I got a job there, and then eventually I just quit the school of visual arts. I quit being a bike messenger. I quit working at Tower Records, and I just worked in the nightlife for like the next 10 years until, I slowly, somehow, weirdly integrated gaming into the whole routine.
Now you worked at Marvel, correct?
Yeah, I didn't work at Marvel. I was a freelancer for Marvel Marvel Comics, and
What were you doing there?
I was drawing comics for a
Wow.
division that was really weird. It was called the Marvel Music Division, and like lots of artists like Dave McKean and not trying to remember the name, Simon something. Um, God, I can't remember, so long ago. But
But it was a special
um,
imprint inside Marvel.
yeah, they did like Alice Cooper comics. They did
Wow.
like Rolling Stones comics, like the
Wow.
band. Yeah, it was all kinds of weird stuff. I think even did a Billy Ray Cyrus comic. I didn't think it was going to go anywhere, but hell, it was like Marvel Comics, and that was always my dream. So I did some stuff on a Public Enemy comic, and I
Wow.
drew in an entire House of Pain, like the jump around group.
Yeah, I know who they are. Yeah.
The whole I did a whole graphic novel around House of Pain, penciled it, inked it, colored it myself.
Wow.
Um, and the really disappointing thing about the House of Pain, I also contributed to a Woodstock comic, but the really disappointing thing about the House of Pain comic is that it never went to print.
Really?
Because, yeah, specifically because that's when Marvel went chapter 11 in the 90s,
Oh.
when the dude from Revlon was the CEO at the time. And literally this, I remember going in one
And then
and
then the
learning.
House of Pain filed Chapter 11.
Yeah, well, they I
They
went
did not last long.
I went in on a Friday, and my editor said that, oh, your comic is at the printers. It's on the printing drums as we speak. It should be going into production, like any minute now or whatever. So I went back on Monday. And if you've ever heard of the famous Marvel bullpen, which was like the in-house staff of like, touch-up artists and everything,
Mhm.
John Romita Jr., famous, senior rather, the famous editor of like all the classic Spider-Man comics and stuff.
Mhm.
Full house. That was Friday. I went in on Monday. The place had been cleaned out,
Oh
like
man.
it had been hit with an atom bomb, completely cleaned out. Nobody there. Ghost town. I was like, is my editor still even here? But like when I buzzed the intercom, he was like, oh yeah, I'll come down and get you. Brought me in. I was like, dude, what happened to everybody? And he told me like the place we filed chapter 11, everybody got laid off, got sent home. And it was like, wow, I actually saw that. So yeah, so the bad news, the after effect of my comic being on the drums, is that they totally stopped every project that was on the drums. They weren't printing them, they weren't distributing them, and they weren't selling them.
You just missed
So
it.
yeah, so that was when I said like, well, maybe the comic industry isn't for me. So
Yep. Or for
so
anyone at that point in time.
yeah, that was like the 90s, 95, 96 era. It was, which is really cool because at that point in my life, I had made like, this is also relative to the time, but like I made about like $25,000 in the space of 3 months, which for me was huge,
Oh
right?
yeah, you thought you
So
were rich.
I was like, oh my God. And at that time I was doing a lot of freelance for like all the major like magazine publishers in the city. I was doing a lot of freelance illustration, fashion design, all kinds of stuff. It was a really good time to be me. And then like the Marvel Comics thing happened, and I was still doing like freelance graphic design. But around that time, I started talking to some investor friends of mine, and we opened our own bar in the city. And for the rest of the 90s, I basically ran my own bar with DJs 7 nights a week in the East Village, and it was very well known. We had a big mural of the Clash London Calling album cover on the side of our the building of our bar.
That'll bring them in.
Yeah, and it was very well known for being like a musical lounge. And so that was cool. But like running a bar, anybody who says like, "Oh my God, I've always wanted to own a restaurant or run a bar or own a bar," they've never run a restaurant, they've never owned a restaurant or run a bar because they still have that fantasy intact. It's a terrible, terrible hand to mouth existence, and that's kind
I
of
have
how I
no
made.
interest in either of those things, James.
Well, that's good for your bank account. Let me put it that way, because that's basically when the game industry came calling. We're in the weird way that it did. I was ready to jump because I was like, "Oh, this steady paycheck thing sounds pretty cool." Health insurance, never experienced that before. I'm just basically lucky that I didn't do anything majorly damaging to myself in the 90s, because I would have been screwed if I ever ended up in the hospital.
Right. How did that happen? How did the games industry come calling, as you said?
Well, uh, as I mentioned, because once I started bartending and having some disposable income in my pockets, I was able to spend some time in the import shops in New York, and I would fairly religiously keep up with Sega Saturn Weekly and PlayStation Weekly magazines out of Japan,
Mm-hmm.
and I would keep track of what was coming out. So I
Now,
was
do you
always
read and speak Japanese?
I read katakana and hiragana, some kanji, not a lot of kanji though, which is really critical. But knowing hiragana and katakana, it's kind of like entering the matrix and suddenly like being able to decode everything.
Right.
You can read all the signs in Japan because almost all of them are in one of the two.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I'm not fluent, but it was enough to get by, and they certainly printed enough pictures to keep me engaged. So.
Yep.
Uh, so eventually, after a certain point, I just decided to write some reviews for fun, and I didn't want to write it like, by the time I started doing this, I was probably like 27, 28.
Mm-hmm.
So I was past the point where I would write something like, "Oh, this sucks," or "This rocks," or anything. I tried
Mm-hmm.
to write it like a proper, intelligent review. Of course, I can't go back and read any of the old stuff that I have on GameSpot right now because it's just so early,
Mm-hmm.
but but I did try my best. So the first game I ever wrote a review on, and they ended up on this, I submitted them to the site called animeplaystation.com, which is so nerdy sounding now, but like at the time, in the days of like GeoCities and those garbage sites, like this site was actually really well done. I think it was like a guy maybe it was out of Hong Kong or something like that, but it had a nice clean layout, and he put screenshots with everything. So it wasn't just this big, terrible word dump.
Mm-hmm.
And I was able to submit the review, and he posted them. Even if the game had like multiple reviews, he'd post them all if they were good enough for his site, and then he'd post screens with it. So it was all nicely formatted. So it was like just fun to see my stuff up on the
Yeah.
internet, because
You
those
weren't
are
getting paid, I'm assuming.
no, it's just for fun, right? But
Mm-hmm.
what was cool was that like when in on the author uh credit, like he would put your name and it would link directly to your email. And so the first review I wrote was one of those crappy Ultraman PS1 fighting games. It wasn't bad for whatever those Bandai games were, but it was still pretty weak. But the second game that I wrote about was Bushido Blade 2,
Mm.
and Joe Fielder from videogamescom saw that one
He
amazingly.
loves that game, by the way. I still remember the fact that he loves Bushido Blade 2.
He loves Bushido Blade 1 more though.
Yeah.
And well, I think most people do, just because
Yeah.
they have a very strong association with it, but I can go into a very, very deep reasoning as to why it is the inferior game. Um, but yeah, so Joe saw the Bushido Blade review, and because he was able to click on my name and send me an email directly to me, I remember, I was still working at I was still managing my bar at that time, and I came home from work late one night or something. It was probably like 6 a.m. And I checked my email before I went to bed. Probably ended up playing a few games of StarCraft too. But I checked my email, and all of a sudden, like, I got an email that said, "Hey, I saw your review of Bushido Blade 2, and I'm the executive editor at videogames.com, and I was interested to know if you'd like to contribute to our I guess, user review site or something. It was more of a community initiative, I think he was talking about initially.
Hmm.
And I was like, hey, sure, wow, that's cool. Like, I mean, I was just doing this for fun anyway, so to do it on a bigger site would be awesome. And seriously, like, it didn't take long to go from that to like fully writing for them, because just because I had his ear, I would email him every time I got like the Sega Saturn Weekly or PlayStation Weekly from like the local Japanese bookstore. I would like look through, sift through the news and say, hey, did you hear about this? Did you hear about this? And he was like, no, but those are great stories. And this was before the internet was as big as it is today. So
Yep.
all this information wasn't being disseminated as easily as it is now, like, on Twitter or anything. So he said, would you like to write up some of these stories for us? I was like, sure. And then I think I had also bought, oh yeah, it was Theme Hospital on PlayStation. And I really loved the game, so I just dropped them a note that said like, hey, have you checked out Theme Hospital for on PlayStation? It's really cool. And he said, no, I haven't, but here's an interesting thing. He's like, EA has still yet to send us a review copy. Would you be interested in writing the review for us? I was like, sure. Well, he was like, yeah, we'd pay you $50 for it or something, or
Cha-ching!
$75 for it. I was like, hell, that paid for that would
The
pay for the
game.
cost of the
Yeah.
game. I was like, I'll do it, sure. So I turned it around really fast, and as as in high quality as I could. And and between that and me bugging him, not bugging him, but like, kind of giving him unsolicited news about Japanese games and stuff all the time, he eventually said, you know what, I've got a proposition for you. How about we put you on retainer and you do up to 4 reviews a month and write as many news stories as you want. I was like, $800 a month just to
Done.
do this stuff, 4 reviews. Shit. I was
Yep.
like, yeah, man. Yeah. So one thing led to another. Eventually, he like talked to the guys in Chicago at EGM. He said like, oh, by the way, if you need help during deadlines, you should talk to our guy James Milkey, because he's really solid, and he's enthusiastic, and he writes really fast. And they're like, oh yeah. So naturally segueing to EGM, um, EGM asked me if like I'd be interested in coming out to Chicago for like, I guess they were working on their big holiday issues, right? And
Hmm.
the deadline is usually like a month or two ahead of those issues. I was like, sure, you're gonna fly me out to Chicago and put me up and just have me write about games? They're like, yep. And like, I was like, all right. So I went
Living in
out
a dream world.
yeah, it was like crazy. So I went out there, and they put me up like, whatever, the Radisson or whatever, and I went to Lombard, their office in Lombard, and I sat down one night, and they were like, can you write these games up? And I was like, sure. And then when I was done, I would give them to Dean Hager, the managing editor, and he was like, wow, you're done already? He's like, how about these? I ended up writing like 14 previews in one night.
Whoa.
And yeah, so by that point, my reputation was becoming a bit legendary within the both offices, just because I was a workhorse.
Let's
Because
be
like,
honest,
dude,
that's all there really was. I mean, you were becoming legendary across the entire industry at that point.
yeah,
That's
I
all
think
there was.
it was just because, like, I've been working in thankless nightlife jobs with no insurance,
Yeah.
12 hours a night, breathing secondhand smoke all night. So here I am, I'm getting to sit down, play games, and like just write about them. I'm like, sure. I think my sheer enthusiasm overshadowed the fact that, like, I probably wasn't technically a very good writer at that time, but over time I figured that out. I figured
Hmm.
out, you know, I got better. I improved. I worked at it. I credit Dan Shu with that, because uh, he really got on my case once he became EIC of EGM, because he was really like, he has a lot of he's just really well educated in the whole grammar thing, which I'm calling it the grammar thing. But he was the editorial. He gave me the book. What was it? The
AP
Strunk
style guide.
the Strunk and White style guide or whatever. Yeah,
Yeah.
something like that. But I know what I'm doing now, 22 years later or whatever. So thank goodness for that. But yeah, but like both publications held open a job position for me for over a year, and it was hard for me to abandon my bar because we had sort of only recently opened it, and I didn't want to bail on my partners, but at the same time, it was like I was the only one actually working at the bar. Everybody else was just an investor, and I was like, well,
Yeah.
I'm the one without the money, so I need to go make a career for myself. So I eventually took GameSpot's offer because I wanted to move to another city.
That
Uh,
wasn't cold and rainy.
yeah, that seemed like it was similar, more similar to New York than I guess Chicago. I wasn't
Well,
too familiar with Chicago, but like, yeah,
you're going
the
to move
cold.
away from New York. You want to go for an upgrade, right? Where to San Francisco, where the weather's nicer and you have the beach and all that.
Yeah, but that's a cold ass beach. But
It
yeah,
is.
so like I went to San Francisco, but yeah, it wasn't anything like New York City. So that was something I learned the hard way. But yeah, but that's how I ended up in San Francisco.
Well,
Fortunately,
Joe Fielder was the person who gave me my first shot in the industry too. He hired me to GameSpot out of college.
here's a toast to Joe.
Toast
Yeah,
to Joe. Yeah.
he's a good guy. I'm glad we're still friends today and
Yep. Me
still
too.
keeping in touch. He's an East Coast boy now, so
I
we're
know. Yeah, he ended up moving back there. I think he was from like Minnesota originally or something, like the Midwest somewhere. At least that's
yeah,
what he told me. At least what I remember anyway.
sounds
So
right.
you worked at GameSpot. Well, it was called videogames.com and then
Well, they had
Video GameSpot, right?
well, I don't know. Video game spot was that actually a thing, or is that
I
just
think it was for a very short period of time. It was like a transition between
wasn't
videogames.com and GameSpot. Yeah.
but GameSpot was always around. It was just the PC sister site of videogames.com, which is a console site.
Right.
If Video Game Spot was a thing, for some reason I associate that with like the stuff that Adam Sessler was doing or something like
It was. Yeah. I mean, the show that
yeah,
he was doing with Lauren, Joe's wife at the
yeah,
time.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yep, that was the name of the show actually that they all worked
yeah.
on
That
together.
that's right. That's why I associate it with that, because that's exactly what it was.
Yep. And so you ended up leaving. You stayed at GameSpot until 2000, which is right when I got there. So we were like ships passing in the night.
Yeah, what's funny is that I was only actually I was only actually at GameSpot full time, even though I freelanced for them on retainer for like almost 2 years by the time I moved out. Um, I only actually worked there full time for 6 months,
Oh, okay.
and it's a kind of an interesting story. But like Joe, because of my experience outside of the gaming industry, and just because I was a little bit older, I think Joe imagined grooming me over for a position maybe to succeed him
Mm-hmm.
when he moved up into upper management or whatever. That's at least based on the conversations I had with him. That's kind of the way it was trending. But like maybe after about like 6 months in or so, um, I think Jeff Gertzman was like maybe feeling a little bit of that possibility or so. And like I think this is all long, you know, under the bridge at this point, so I don't think it really matters to disclose it. But um, I guess at the time, like Joe was probably wanted a little bit more performance out of Jeff or something like that. Maybe Jeff had gotten too comfortable or whatever. But
Mm-hmm.
um, I guess the quick and dirty version is that me showing up sort of lit a fire under Jeff, and he started really cranking.
Mm-hmm.
So, which was great for the site because I think that's ultimately what Joe wanted. But Joe took me aside at one point and said, by the way, I know like, you're probably under the impression that, your trajectory was going to go, in this way at the site, in this way at the site. But if I had to pick a successor right now, I would have to go with Jeff. And I said, well, that's cool. I mean, he's been
Mm-hmm.
here for years. I've just been here. I've only been here for 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
But right around that time is when EGM came calling again, and I had, it was only 6 months prior, or a little bit more than that, where I had to choose between the two because eventually they were going to have to fill those spots. And it was really hard. It was really hard to make a decision because I loved the guys on EGM, but I also loved the guys on GameSpot because I felt the loyalty to the fact that they quote unquote discovered me and got me into
Yeah.
this industry to begin with. So I didn't know what to do, but ultimately also the fact that I was moving out with my girlfriend at the time, like we both wanted to move to San Francisco over Chicago. And so I had to turn down the EGM guys. But then the EGM guys came back and said, hey, not sure if this is of any interest to you, but we're opening a West Coast office. It would work out of the Beale Street office with CGW. And we're wondering if you'd be interested in that job now. And you wouldn't have to move. You could stay in San Francisco. You would be our West Coast editor, and you would meet with all the. It would be easier because all the publishers are in the Bay Area, and this way they don't have to come all the way out to Chicago every time
And
they want
the
to
people
show
in Chicago don't have to travel all the way out to the West Coast either.
Exactly. It was just a logistics matter. So I was like, well, that sounds cool. I said, I'm sure you haven't thought about what you want to offer as a salary. They're like, oh no, we have thought about it. It's this. And I was like, wow,
Like a
okay.
huge raise over what you were getting at GameSpot.
A huge raise. Well, one of the financial factors in choosing one over the other was also that, like, because Chicago's cost of living was a lot less than San Francisco, their offer was a lot less. And GameSpot wasn't that much more, but it was more, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what EGM came back with at that point was 10,000 more than what I was making at GameSpot at that time. So that basically just increased my salary by $15,000 within the space of 6 months. So I was like, wow, this couldn't have worked out better.
Life has a way of working out like that, doesn't it?
Yeah. So, but the funny thing is though, that Joe was like, Fielder was like, when he suddenly got wind that I was about to bail, or I went to him. It wasn't like a roundabout kind of thing. I just went to him. I said, just so you know, I'm like having to consider an offer because EGM came back to me. And remember, we were all part of the same Ziff
Family.
Davis
Ziff
group.
Davis. Yeah.
It
Yep.
was owned by SoftBank at that time. It was just before they sold all the parts off to different entities, but this was all still part of the same family. So I said, just so you know, Joe, and just to be completely transparent about this, I got an offer from John Davison, and I'm having to consider it because, given what you just told me about, like the hierarchy here, which is completely fair, I get
Yeah.
it,
Mm-hmm.
and this is not in any way related to that. I'm not bitter about anything, but like, it's just, hey, I could
Simple
be.
economics. I mean, let's be honest.
It's hard to turn down like that. That was like, almost a 33. No, that was almost like a 25% raise at that point. So it was kind of hard to say no to something like that.
San Francisco is so expensive then too. I mean, it still is, but back
Yeah.
then even it was still really expensive. Like every extra dollar that you could make there would make a difference in your life.
Yeah. And my girlfriend who I had moved out there with, we were breaking up right around that time, and I wasn't going to move. So the apartment that we were splitting the rent at was suddenly all mine to pay for. So
Mm-hmm.
this was another factor, right? So
Yep.
I was like, so Joe was like, okay, well, I'm giving you to the end of the week. I need to, E3 is coming up, so I need to know who's on my team, who's not. I said, okay, that's fair. And then I said, well,
I'm just gonna tell you right now.
I took the weekend and I was
You
like,
did.
I was like,
Out of respect to
I
Joe, I'm guessing.
yeah, and I was like, hey, I appreciate everything you've done for me, and it's not like I'm going anywhere. I'm still here, to help out, whatever. But I kind of have to take this offer because it's a huge deal. Remember, at that time, the Prestige was still in print,
Right. Yeah.
and not as much with the website stuff. So,
Mm-hmm.
I'm old school, so I kind of enjoyed seeing my work in print, and the
Yep.
opportunity to be a part of that was really cool, and to work with those guys and to live in San Francisco at the same time. It was like best of all worlds. So I had to take that opportunity. The interesting thing though is that um, when my buddy Sam Kennedy, heard that I was going to be leaving GameSpot, he was like, "Oh man, I don't want to stay here if you're going." And I was like, because like that's when Gamers.com
Yep.
had I guess just started kicking off. Remember, this was the era of what do you call it? Like all the .coms, right? So
Yeah. And then
he
there was
was like,
Games Radar, which was different than what it is now.
right. There were just a lot of sites. There was tons of sites and
Popping
tons of
up. Yeah.
publications popping up, like that magazine MCV and all kinds of
Yep.
stuff. And this was a very exciting time. Dreamcast was coming and going, all that stuff. So PS2 was launching, and and Sam was like, I'm thinking about going to gamers.com. And I was like, dude, trust me, they're not going to be around 6 months from now. Come with me to. And I called up John Davison. I said, hey, I know you want me to come join you at EGM, but there's a very good possibility that I might be able to get Sam Kennedy come with me. Do you have a spot for him anywhere? And and John said, let me call you back. And he called me back like something like a half hour later. He's like, yeah, Sam's in. I was
Wow.
like, and I went to Sam and I said, hey, come with me. Like I got you sorted. And then that was like kind of a historical moment for us as friends to
Yep.
be able to move over to the print side together. Eventually we all came back to the web side of things, but
Everybody did. You had no choice after a while.
that's
Let's
all.
talk. Let's talk about those years at EGM though. After you went there, in fact, that's how we met. Because my first job at GameSpot was magazine editor, and my job was to put websites on GameSpot.com for all of Ziff's magazines. So EGM, like every month, I would get like this email that had all these assets, all the reviews, everything, and I had to construct the website from that stuff. And you and I ended up actually working on that stuff together. So that's how I ever met you for the first time. But those years at EGM, I mean, I try to stay away from hyperbole, but really they were kind of magical, to be honest with you. As you said, there was a lot more prestige with the magazines even then, because websites were just kind of starting up. The internet was slow. Video wasn't really a thing yet. And I think a lot of people were like you and preferred to kind of get that information in a magazine. That run at EGM there in the early aughts really kind of was the pinnacle for games magazines, I believe. And I think a lot of people agree with me on that. What do you think it was about EGM at that time that made it that way?
Yeah, what's funny is that like the Ziff Davis era of EGM, of course, wasn't the first era of EGM, right? It was that was the Sendai era. That was the early days with folks like Andy Barron and those guys. And
But you guys did something that made it different
I,
and
the way
special.
I look at it is like I think it was the journey of game magazines, and I mean Journey the band, not Journey the game, right? It's like Journey was Journey, and they were a good like blues kind of band, like a boogie band, until Steve Perry joined, and all of a sudden it was Journey, the classic lineup that everybody knows because of the hits, right? I think EGM happened right at the right time. That version of EGM happened like when like during the Super Nintendo era, during the Genesis, when gaming really started to entrench itself and like set roots. So it was beginning to become impervious to the whole fad thing. It wasn't going to go away like like the hot toy of the Christmas season. It was something that was going to stay around and was going to grow and it was going to evolve. And EGM was there to document it. I read it before I ever joined them.
Yeah, everyone
And
did.
when I joined them, it was like surreal to me. I was like, I'm on EGM right now, right? So that's I think why. And then of course, once the 32-bit era, jumped off, that was when EGM was right there along for the ride. Xbox, all that stuff. We were there, and we were the biggest game magazine for the longest time, right until Game Informer came in and did their thing. So I think we were there for the best part of the. I think like maybe the best days of gaming. Of course, the games are much more incredible now than they were then from a technological perspective. But
It was a
man,
transformative time because the medium had gone from 2D to 3D, really.
yeah,
I mean, it's the
there's
biggest
that.
shift the industry will ever really see.
There was that, and it also brought home entertainment and gaming together. It wasn't like, oh well, the kids are off in the other room playing the video games on the TV, right? Because it could only do that. But once like PlayStation 2 came out with the DVD player and all that stuff, it started to bring the family together into the living room because they're all fighting over the same device now. But those were still the pure days, because before the DVD players and all that stuff, the game systems were just about games. I remember Akihabara. I remember the last pure year of going to TGS and Akihabara and stuff like that was the GameCube era, because the GameCube couldn't do anything except play games.
Yeah.
Everything after that, everything after the PlayStation 2 became like an entertainment center, right? Microsoft became more concerned about putting everything in one box, and it became more than just games. And that's when it started to get kind of diluted for me. So I think EGM was just there for like the best part of the pure video gaming experience, and we were able to document a lot of that.
Do you think maybe that part of what made EGM special was that you guys were able to develop personalities that people remembered? Like, you were called the Milkman. Where'd that nickname come from? Did you like that you were suddenly called the Milkman? Like, how did that all happen?
Well, people called me anything milk adjacent for my entire life, just because my last name is Milky, and it's like it's an Americanization of a German name, which is pronounced Mielke, but like who's gonna pronounce Mielke everywhere you go, right? So it just turned into Milky because the last letter is an E. Milky, Milkman, Milky the Marvelous Milking Cow, which was a terrible toy for me to grow up along with in the 70s and 80s. But so I've been called Milkman since I was in elementary school.
Okay.
So it was a natural transition to, into my adult life, I guess.
But people knew you as the Milkman. There was Sushi X, who was this mysterious character. Who was Sushi X?
I don't think I'm still at liberty to say, and that's got to remain a mystery.
I think people know, but I just wanted you to, at least I think I know. I just wanted you to maybe say it on the podcast. I mean, I've been told by a lot of people who worked at EGM during that area that it was everyone. There was no one Sushi X. Is that not right?
Here's the God's honest truth. I'm not even really sure, because like I honestly never had any part of that. I was always my thing. I never had to ghostwrite for Sushi X. I never had to do anything. Like, I think the other guys handled that stuff. So
gotcha.
I don't know which one that is. If you ask me who the Game Geezer was, I could tell you, but Sushi X, it's TBD.
Okay. But do you think that maybe you guys were kind of the first like YouTubers / Twitch streamers, people who had kind of this personality that kind of permeated their work more than just being kind of straight down the line journalists?
Well, print allows for that, just because you get to put your picture, you get to write your bio, it's reflected in your writing style. I think, people would become known for certain things. I mean, I always had people send me messages or emails or comments to me on Twitter or whatever that said like, "Oh man, you were one of my favorite editors because I always felt like I could trust you," or whatever, which basically is code for we like the same stuff.
Right.
Fighting games, Japanese games, niche games, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was cool. So I mean, like, people just find that and they latch on to the editors that they identify most with, and that's cool, because the people who liked what I did, they all come from really diverse backgrounds, and it's always fun and also occasionally weird to meet people in real life, like when you're really not expecting it. Like, I've been walking through the streets of New York and somebody will come up to me. This has happened like 4 or 5 times in New York, where they come up to me and say, "Are you James Milky?" And I'm like, wow, this is really, I didn't expect this in a bookstore.
That's happened to me a few times. One time my sister was out here from Pittsburgh and we went to the movies, and somebody walked up to me at the movie theater and said, "Are you Shane Satterfield?" And I'll never forget the look on my sister's face, because I didn't really talk about what I did to my family. I didn't think they even understood what I did. But at that moment, she understood. She was like, "Holy moly, like, people know who my brother is, like, randomly at a movie. It's crazy."
Well, you were right on the cusp of like when things started to move over into the realm of video content, right?
Yeah.
I still consider myself a print era kind of dude. So, especially at some of the times where this has happened, remember, we have like little thumbnail size, stamp size pictures, and yet somebody's picking up on that in the city or San Francisco, or it's happened in Europe too. It's pretty wild. Or it actually happened to me at Narita Airport in Tokyo. And the guy who introduced himself to me now is still a good friend to this day. So that's like
awesome,
crazy, weird, and cool. Yeah. I'm always unprepared for it.
So that started a run at Ziff that went until 2009. You launched, if I remember correctly, GMR. Then you went to One Up, I believe, as an executive editor. And then you went back to EGM as an EIC. Did I have that all
No,
right?
well, let's see. Like I was just trying to remember the transition. Yeah, so yes, your timeline is pretty much accurate. Went from EGM to GMR. Simon Cox gave me a great opportunity with GMR, so I went over there, and it was really
That was
good
a
for
good
me
magazine.
because
That was different from everything
yeah,
else that was out there.
we basically tried to, because Simon's an ex-Edge editor, so we basically tried to kind of channel the Edge ethos into,
I could see
a,
it. Yep.
a magazine like GMR, where it's business model wise, it was similar to what Game Informer was doing at the time, which is basically to give it to anybody who walks into the store. But once Electronics Boutique went away, so did the magazine. So fair enough. But during our 2-year run, we did try to bring like strong graphic design and a very independent voice for what it was essentially a licensed magazine, to the masses. It's when Engage is a sponsor for your entire magazine, and then you review the Engage hardware and give it like a 4 out of 10.
Yeah.
So that's pretty editorially independent. We got some
Which I
high.
appreciated. Yeah.
So that was,
I
yeah.
always look for that in publications. What would you say was your crowning achievement, your shining moment at your time at Ziff?
Gee, I mean, it was, none of that could have happened without the entire staff. Like what I can say honestly about every team I worked with at Ziff was always, like, because I had job offers come in from the competition and stuff, and those guys paid substantially more money than Ziff Davis did. But I stuck with Ziff because the culture was great, the people were great, and I was never one to chase the money, because I knew I wouldn't be happy with like maybe the new crew. I like these guys that I grew up with. So um I don't know if there's any particular thing that I would point to as my crowning achievement. Like it was always a team based effort. We were always underpaid and understaffed, always.
That's
And the
games
fact that
journalism in a nutshell, James. I mean,
it
that's
is,
just
but
unless you work at IGN.
but
IGN
at
overstaffed.
but with Ziff Davis, at Ziff Davis it was always even more so, right? And like we always had fewer people. Like when we were on the ground at E3, it would be we would have like one person per console, right? Whereas like other teams had like video editors and multiple people covering Nintendo or Sega or Microsoft. For us, it was like a one. Well, I remember when Joe Fielder, when I was still at GameSpot, and he said, Milky, this year you cover Sega. And that meant cover everything by
Everything.
Sega.
Yeah.
Write up all the games by yourself. There was no rest. So
Yep.
I guess if it's a purely personal individual highlight, I was definitely honored to be the EIC for EGM,
I
even
figured
though
that would be it. Yeah.
closing year, when we knew that Shu was going to move out of the position and take over John Davison's old position. And Shu and I had some tough times, mostly because I was like a willful individual, and he was the guy who was much better at writing than I was, and he was giving it to me. But we got over that, and I think because we got over that, and because I worked hard, and even though I argued with him at times, we may have fought, but it was always with respect, right? And when he said like, okay, well, throw your hat in the ring if you want to be EIC of EGM, right? It wasn't said like that, but that was essentially the call to arms. And so I went to him, and I think he probably really respected that, because even though we hadn't always seen eye to eye or been on the same page, we knew at the end of the day, we just wanted to put out a really good product.
Yep.
And the fact that we had that adversarial kind of relationship for a while, and the fact that I was still coming to him and saying like, I think I can do this job, he gave me strong consideration because of that, because I was like maybe the less obvious choice for him. But like once you started to, come down to the qualifications, well, this guy has to be able to run a website. This guy has to be able to run a magazine. This guy has to be able to make the two sides talk to each other. I was one of the only logical choices at SIFT because I had the website not experience under my belt.
Yep.
So I'm really grateful to him for seeing past any
We
beef we
probably could just see that you had the passion that you needed to do the job. I mean, let's be honest.
yeah.
Passion accounts for a lot, man. A lot.
It did, and it was hard because we knew that the company was going to be sold, and internally we knew the company was going to be sold, and we knew that the magazine probably wasn't going to last much more than another year because our burn rate was so high with over 650,000 subscribers and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
You're spending well over $1 million a month just producing a single magazine.
Right.
So that was only going to sustain itself for so long. So kudos to him. He gave me a shot. I like to think, I did the job. The team certainly did the job. They were amazing. I can't give enough credit to everybody who worked on that magazine. But yeah, so that was probably my favorite thing because I was able to put all the things I loved about gaming into that magazine. Hopefully it showed.
It definitely showed. And then in 2012, you moved into game development. You joined Q Games and you were working on the Pixel Junk franchise. What was it like for you to go from being a games journalist to a game developer? And what was the thing that you would say caught you most off guard about game development, sort of going over to the other side?
Well, just to fill in the gap there, when I left EGM, because One Up got bought out by UGO,
Mm-hmm.
I went directly from San Francisco to Japan then, and I went to Q Entertainment first
Right.
before Q Games, which
With
always
Mizuguchi, right?
Yeah, so it was like Q to Q.
But
No
that's a perfect
relation
fit
between
for
the
you because
companies.
Miz was making games that were incorporating music.
Yeah, so that was the perfect fit for me, and everybody knew it. But what is less known is that I actually had two job offers on my plate, which one was from Valhalla, the new studio that was just opened up by the ex-Team Ninja guys who departed Tecmo at that time.
Yeah.
With
Itagaki-san.
Right. And so he was offering me a job uh, at the same time, literally the same time that Tetsuya had offered me a job. And that was really hard because I love both of those guys to death, and I had to say no to one of them.
Mm-hmm.
But it was pretty clear cut for me which one I had to take because my wife was pregnant. We were going to have our first baby, and I knew that Valhalla / X Team Ninja guys' reputation and it wasn't just a reputation. I knew their work habits. It was that they would stay at the studio for weeks on end without going home, without seeing their families. They would have sleeping bags under the bed. They would shower at the office, and they would not go home. And they smoked a lot.
I lived with them for 2 weeks and did a documentary with them for a Ninja Gaiden Sigma. So I know exactly what you're talking about.
Right.
They were crazy. They partied really hard too. They would go to the bar and get trashed and then go back to work.
And I don't drink and I don't smoke. At least I'll have a cocktail on occasion, New Year's Eve, sure, why not? But I don't smoke, and I'm very weak around alcohol, so I'll just get headaches all day, right? So those are two things that I couldn't really participate in.
Yep.
And I certainly was not down with the, hey, I have a newborn that I haven't seen in a month, that kind of stuff. So that compared with the smaller, more nimble projects at Q Entertainment, that were music based, working with Miz, who's like a fountain of optimism.
Yeah,
it really wasn't.
He is really a positive guy. Yep.
But it was hard to say no to Itagaki-san because he is such a dear friend, and
I think you chose well because Valhalla lasted for what, 2 years maybe.
No, what's funny is that they lasted for it took them about 8 years to get their one game out. So by the time they didn't get their game out until after I was already back in New York.
Yeah, and the game ended up being really terrible. Yeah,
it flatlined. Ironically, it was DOA, but but I did choose correctly because with Q Entertainment, I was able to get a couple full games under my belt, producer credits, and then I had a wealth of other experience that I gained from that company. And Miz is such a mentor to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I was able to expand on that experience going down to Kyoto, and then joining Q Games and being on the Pixel Junk series, and also probably the most significant thing with Q Games is that I was able to start Bit Summit.
Right. Yep.
So
So going back
that
to my question though, what was the thing about development that was like, this isn't what I expected, or kind of caught you off guard?
and this is going to sound like I'm full of shit, but like, to be honest, like I don't really feel like I was taken off guard by anything
Wow.
specifically because being in being in the games industry, games media side of things for the longest time, and speaking with and interviewing, people like Kojima, Miyamoto, all these people from that tier all the way down to like the most indie tier possible, you get a really good sense of like the breadth of experience and like what the working conditions are like and what the expectations are of developers and stuff
It's
like
made me
that.
not want to work in development.
Yeah,
I have no interest in making games because I've been talking to game developers for 23 years.
the funny thing is, it's like whenever I used to get trashed by people like fanboys on message boards or whatever, saying like, "Oh, you don't know what you're talking about," like because they didn't agree with my review or whatever. I was like, you know what? What you deserve is you deserve a job in the game industry. That would be the punishment you deserve, because everybody thinks you're playing games all day when it's really that takes up maybe 5% of your time.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
putting a magazine together takes up the rest of your time. But
Yeah.
with video game stuff, it's like the funny thing is that there are certain developers that everybody idolizes, right?
Mm-hmm.
The only developer, honestly, that I think is up with his public persona is Miz, because
Mm-hmm.
he's as cheerful in real life as he is in his public persona. And his public persona is really kind of like low key right now. Ever
Yeah.
since like I guess kind of post Dreamcast, post Q Entertainment days, it's been a much Miz has been deferred the attention to, I think, his team more than anything else, so that's cool. But I've got so many stories about other developers that from friends of mine, expats who worked at other development studios, and their bosses, like the ones that everybody idolizes. And I've just got horror stories. I've got
Mm-hmm.
reams full of horror stories. I've got gigabytes of horror stories just about what kind of nightmare these guys are. And I'll see people that you and I mutually know and respect, kind of fawning over them on Twitter. So, oh my God, it would be a dream to work at this studio. And
No.
I'd like, I PM them. I'd be like, bro, trust me, you do not want to work there. It's all a fantasy.
Uh-huh.
Don't even think about it. Just trust me on this. Yeah. So it's
Interesting.
it's I'm sorry, I think I've avoided your question again. What was the most surprising thing?
Yeah.
It wasn't really surprising. It was just a shift in gears. I've always been
Mm-hmm.
a creator, so this allowed me to create in ways that are more closely aligned with what I was originally doing when I was an illustrator, when I was with Marvel Comics. It's just that instead of just creating characters or concepts, now I can design the game mechanics around it. Now I can decide what the musical angle is going to be, what the visual style is, right? This is more of what I always wanted to do. Video game magazines were also a creative exercise. It was a print publication, was a a video game site here, graphic design, this, visual design, UI, UX. It's all a creative exercise. But I will definitely say that if anything, making video games is more satisfying to me than writing about them.
Okay.
I don't want to write about somebody else's work. I want to create my own.
And have people like me write about it.
I have people like you trash me on message boards about how shit my game is.
Now, you alluded earlier about Bit Summit, which is an indie games conference that happens in Japan. What inspired you to start Bit Summit?
Well, the the reality is that like nobody really knew what the indie scene was like in Japan, because we came up with the idea for it when all the Western indie devs, like like Phil Fish and like the FTL guys, and that game company, they were just knocking it out of the park with all these cool indie games. And I remember having a conversation with Dylan Cuthbert one day about like, why isn't Japan getting the credit it deserves for this? Because Cave Story is really what kicked off that whole indie scene.
Mm-hmm.
The second wave of I think the new genesis of video game development. Where it went back to basics, and people were discovering new talent for the first time. So I said, that's a good question. I don't know. So I pondered it for a little while, and I went back to Dylan. I said, I said, this is going to sound like a crazy idea, but why don't we start our own indie game convention? And as since we're Q Games, is a very well established company at that point. I'm like, that'll help get some eyes on it, because if it was just like, oh, indie game thing in Japan, whatever, blah blah blah, people would be like, all right, whatever. But if Q Games is involved, we can use that kind of like cred
It's a springboard.
to get eyes on it. And then so I was using my relationships with developers, my relationships with media, and I didn't really have the sponsorship connections yet, but like other key members at Q Games, helped with that, helped talk to Unity, helped talk to Unreal, got those conversations going. So the developers wanted to know what media were coming, the media wanted to know what developers were coming. So once we convinced a couple big names to come and attend the show, like Swery, also Crispies, the guys who made Tokyo Jungle, once we started telling the media that those guys came on, then all the media started signing up. And then once we were able to tell other developers like Masaya Matsura from Parappa the Rapper and Nana Onsha that all these media were coming, then he was like, okay, I'll join, and it sort of snowballed from there. So, and the first one was just for 150 people, but then the next year it was like 4,000 people. And then the year after that, every year after that, it just has gone up by the thousands. So now we're at like 15, 16, 17,000 people in attendance, which was just
something to be proud of, really.
It's crazy. I'm like, wow, I can't believe I had a hand in this. So
yeah, more than a hand. You're one of the founders of it. It was your vision that made it happen. And
yeah, I can honestly say that, like, I came up with the name Bit Summit, and I'm like, I was thinking like, well, what would be cooler than Bit Summit? But that's
a great idea. It's a great name.
It's about as pure as you get.
Yep, it explains it in the title, and that's what you want. So, so then eventually you started your own studio with someone who's a mutual friend of ours. You mentioned him earlier, Sam Kennedy, who created NeoGAF, one of the many things that he's done in his career.
Yep.
And you guys launched not just a studio, but a VR studio. You launched a game called Jupiter and Mars. Why did you decide to do a VR game for your first game?
Well, one of the things I learned at Q Entertainment was that, it's always fun to be like in there early, because when you're there at a new technology early, there's always going to be people who are really enthusiastic, and they're going to associate you. I mean, you think back to the launch of PlayStation, you're going to think about Ridge Racer, you're going to think about Wipeout, you're going to think about Tekken, Toshinden, stuff like that, right? Those will always resonate with you. So, it's always just smart business to be there with a new technology. Second, I really love VR. It's quite honestly, I love VR because you can take any basic ass game concept, put it in VR, and all of a sudden it's just a tremendous new experience because it's so spatial, right? Yep. You could put Pong in VR, and all of a sudden that's just like you've got this big giant ball coming at you, and you're like, what the hell, right?
I mean, isn't that what Beat Saber is, really? It's set to music, but it's really just kind
actually,
of Pong.
That's a good observation. But like the example that I usually use is like Pac-Man, because and they actually have that now. They have Pac-Man VR in Japanese arcades. But if so, all of a sudden like, I've played paintball, and I remember coming out of a paintball session just so exhausted because you're so physically tense all the time, looking around a corner, wondering if you're going to get nailed.
Yeah.
But like if Pac-Man was VR and you're running down the hallway and all of a sudden Blinky and Inky come around the corner, you're shitting yourself because you're like, oh, I'm like, gotta run the other way. And that is just such a simple game. But can you imagine playing Defender in VR?
Right, right. Yeah.
That would be just unimaginable. So like, I really love VR. And that's where the opportunity was, because Sony had a small budget in Japan that they were using to conjure up some new VR projects. And I went to them and said, I'd love to make a game for PSVR. And they said, well, what are you interested in making? And I brought them like 4 or 5 concepts. And they're the ones who actually picked out Jupiter and Mars.
Interesting.
And which was a game, that concept that I came up with when I was at Q Entertainment. And I was doing most of the new IP designs at Q Entertainment. That I had like 5 games that were greenlit that we never got to make. And so it was really gratifying to be able to make Jupiter and Mars for PSVR. It was a great learning experience too. So I wouldn't
ecological message in that game too, which is great. It has something
yeah,
to say.
and that was, I think it was very cutting edge for the time. Now we're part of the United Nations Playing for the Planet Alliance, which is made up of developers and companies, all with ecological either messaging in their games or initiatives on the kind of B2C side, like the, consumer facing side. And so, we're no longer like, the only game in town, but it's great to see, that's not a distinction we want to be alone in. We the more the merrier, like the more people who are getting in on this, the better it is, I think, for the future, because what we're doing is we're communicating hopefully to like a group of people, gamers, that the typical BBC Earth documentary might not be reaching. I watch that stuff, and by osmosis, my kids watch it because I'm like, hey kids, look at this thing about monkeys. And but the average Fortnite fan isn't putting his game down so he can listen to David Attenborough talk about this
narrate
species.
something.
Yeah, which is a shame. So if we can somehow communicate with people and get them to be a little bit more, be a little bit more provocative or thought-provoking about topics that might be dry to them or something, then hopefully we've achieved something good.
Now, do you think Tigertron's going to release another game? Is that something that you think is going to happen? And will it be a VR game?
We're definitely working on new projects for sure. It's a little early for us to talk about what they are.
Mm-hmm.
What was the second half of that question?
Do you think it'll be a VR game?
I can definitely say we're still working in the VR space, but we're not exclusively working in the VR space. We're just a studio that happened to release our first game as a VR and flat experience. You can play Jupiter and Mars,
you can play it in 2D.
Don't have a VR headset, which unfortunately most people don't seem to realize. But yeah, I mean, we love the technology, and let's just put it this way: Oculus Quest makes it very easy to show this to people because you can just take it anywhere and you're not tethered to anything. So that's a cool thing.
Yep, it changes everything. James, what do you think is next for you?
Well,
Tigertron, obviously, continuing working there.
Well, I've been recently. I've been working on getting. I've been applying to this fellowship out of New Zealand called the Edmund Hillary Fellowship, and it's just a really amazing group of entrepreneurs, investors, all invested in making a global impact in all the myriad areas where there can be improvements in the world, like whether it's like affordable housing, access to medicines, initiatives that are just so diverse and
you're getting real. What you're saying is you're starting to do things in the real world instead of the virtual world.
Yeah, it's like I have a little bit of imposter syndrome. I'm not going to lie, because I'm just like, my whole pitch was like, look, basically what I was saying about like using video games as a way to try and like connect with an audience that is far more active. Because gamers aren't just passively watching a movie. They're picking up the controller and they're controlling their own destinies in games, and we're just trying to make games like the games that we grew up loving, but in settings that are actually inspired by the real world. So just to be clear about our games, we're not like infotainment or anything like that. We're not trying to ram a message down anybody's throat. But with Jupiter and Mars, it's familiar environments submerged under cataclysmic sea level. So you're seeing iconic environments like New York, London, Greece underwater. So we're hoping that it has like a Planet of the Apes kind of impact, where you look at it and say like, gosh, could this really happen in the real world? This has been such a cool game. But it didn't occur to me that like, well, if all the ice caps melt, would the city actually be submerged under this much ocean? Right. So if that person's curious or stimulated or moved enough to like go and Google it and find out for themselves. Hey Siri, what would happen if all the ice caps melted? How high would the sea levels be? It might only be a couple feet over the ground in New York City, but that would be enough to destroy the entire city.
Yeah.
So if we can achieve any of that, we can hopefully inspire the next generation to do something about it or to help save themselves, more than what we can do right now in the time we have left. And this is something I tell my kids every day, and they're probably sick of it, but that's sort of the goal. So we'll see whether or not it happens. But anyway, so the Edmund Hillary Fellowship, like I was accepted, which was just amazing. And so for me, once right now they have like really closed borders because of COVID, but hopefully once they open back up, I would be able to move my family there with any luck. There's a lot of things that have to happen. So it's also possible that it might not happen, but I've been accepted into the fellowship. Hypothetically, I have the opportunity to move to New Zealand.
Wow.
and work more closely with all these amazing people that have also been accepted. I think something like maybe like 1,400 people applied
Wow.
in the last thing, and only 250 got accepted. So,
Elite
my hope is,
company.
yes, I mean, really, some of these people are just amazing and inspiring in what they do, and it actually inspires me to do a better job of what I'm trying to do. So my whole thing is trying to leverage this amazing entertainment medium of gaming, and trying to do something new and good with it, and involve all these other people who are just, I'm lucky to be shoulder to shoulder with, and hopefully come up with some new initiatives. So maybe something I've never even dreamed of. Right now, I'm just thinking about games, the environment, and getting it into people's hands. But maybe there's a more effective hybrid of all this stuff that might manifest in ways I've never even thought of. So that's the goal.
It's amazing. And I think as all of us get older, we start to think a little more philanthropically. How can we start giving back to the world that's given us so much? So I admire you for taking that approach as you sort of reach. I mean, you've kind of done it all in the games industry at this point. Once you make a game, you've covered games. You've pretty much run the gamut at this point. So just an amazing career you've had already, James. I can't wait to see what's next. And before we go, first of all, thank you for coming on the show. I've had a great time talking with you. Where can people find you on social media? Where can they find Tigertron on social media? Anything else that you would like to promote before we go?
If you're looking for me on Twitter to talk smack at me or whatever, you can find me at Limited Run James. And that name came up because I also work for Limited Run Games, doing low key things that help move the chains at the company, and those guys are super great. They're super friends, and they're just a lovely bunch of people to work with. So I'm really lucky to work with them. I juggle many things. I juggle Tigertron, I juggle Limited Run Games tasks, I juggle the family, the initiatives in New Zealand. There's a lot of things going on. Bit Summit is, fortunately there's a team running Bit Summit now, and I just get to work on the creative stuff with Bit Summit. But yeah, I mean, there's so many things going on. There's time enough for rest after I'm dead. That's the way I look at it. So
I look at life that way too. Absolutely. And where can people find Tigertron on social media?
Tigertron's on Twitter. That's probably the easiest way, and it's Tigertron NYC, all one word.
All right.
And you can find us there. I think we'll have stuff to talk about, like probably around summertime.
Okay.
If everything goes
pretty
according
soon, in a couple months here.
Yeah, so we'll fire up the social media engine once that's ready. But we're excited about what we've got to show people. So knock on wood.
Well, James, thanks again for coming on 3-Night Weekend. We really appreciate it. It's been a great time talking with you.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. You brought me back to the old days.
All right, now it's time to figure out what the hell you're going to do with your weekend with a little help from your friends.
Games!
No huge games coming out this weekend, but there are a few worth keeping an eye on. First up, The Legend of Heroes Trails of Cold Steel 4. It's a great JRPG, a massive game. It's available now for PC and Switch. Next up, Enlisted is a pretty cool game. It's a hybrid of first-person shooter and MMO set during World War II. It's available for PC, PS5, and Xbox Series consoles. If you're like us and you're a child trapped in an adult body, Scarlet Hood in the Wicked Wood is an adventure game that features a modern take on Little Red Riding Hood. It's available for PC and Mac. And then finally, maybe you were a little nervous about checking out Outriders because of the network issues it's had. They're all pretty much sorted out now, and we're really enjoying the game, so we definitely recommend that.
TV and film.
It's a real slow week for TV and film, but there's a couple things worth keeping an eye on. First up is The Nevers, Season 1. It debuts on HBO on Sunday. It's a science fiction drama about a gang of Victorian women with superpowers, so taking a different angle on the superhero show. And then on Sunday, the 6th season of Fear the Walking Dead debuts on AMC, and in our opinion, it's become the better of the two Walking Dead shows.
Music.
We have a strange mix of new albums coming out today. First up is Cheap Trick, In Another World. Yes, Cheap Trick is still making new music, although if you listen to the new album, you would think that it could have come from the 70s or the 80s. It's out now. Next up for our indie pick this week, it's a group called Small Black. Its new album is called Cheap Dreams. It's the 4th studio album from the synth pop group and the first new music from them in 5 years. The band describes the sound of the new album as, quote, Long Island Gothic Surf Epic, unquote. And then finally, for those of you who like more commercial music, Taylor Swift has a new album coming out today. It's called Fearless, Taylor's version. I don't know if you guys know, but she's been embroiled in these crazy lawsuits over her music, and she's starting to get some of it back. So what she's done is she's redone 6 songs that were cut from her 2008 album, Fearless.
Sports.
Undoubtedly, the biggest sporting event this weekend is the Masters. It kicks off today at 3 p.m. on ESPN and then moves to CBS for Saturday and Sunday. And then tonight in the NHL, the Wild takes on the St. Louis Blues on NHL Network at 8 p.m. Moving on to Saturday, the NASCAR Cookout 250 is on Fox Sports 1 at 12:50. Moving into the evening, the NCAA College Hockey Championship game is on ESPN at 7 p.m. Eastern. Then the Lakers take on the Nets at 8:30 p.m. Eastern on ABC. That should be a great game. The Nets and the Lakers, two of the best teams in the NBA. And then UFC Fight Night is live on ESPN at 8 p.m. Eastern. And then the Volvo Car Open is airing on the Tennis Channel, and that's both Saturday and Sunday. Speaking of Sunday, a very slow day for sports other than the final round of the Masters. In soccer, we have the Italian Serie A, which is Fiorentina versus Atalanta. That's on ABC at 2:30. And then in MLB, the Phillies take on the Braves at 7 p.m. Eastern on ESPN.
Esports.
Tons of esports going on this weekend, but we picked the 3 events that we think will garner the most interest. First up is the Rocket League RLCS Season X Spring North America with a $100K purse. Next up is the Dota 2 East Asia Pacific Predator League for $85K. And then finally, the ESL PUBG Masters Americas for $50K. Thanks for checking out 3 Night Weekend on Sifted Games at sifted.net. A huge thanks to James Mielke for sharing his amazing journey through the games industry. If you want to get it when it's hot and fresh, head to patreon.com/sifted and give us a pledge. If you give us $4 a month or more, you'll get this every Friday morning. If you want to know when the show is posted for free, follow us on Twitter at Sifted Games. And if you want to reach out to me and suggest future guests, you can find me at Dinfire. I'm Shane Satterfield reminding you that every weekend is a 3 Night Weekend.